Welcome back. The organisation Human Rights Watch says it's worried that an increasing number of people are being targeted by their governments when in fact they're in other countries. For example, India has had to recently deny it was involved in killing a political leader in Canada. Russia from time to time has been accused of killing former spies in the UK. Rwanda was once accused of killing its former head of intelligence in a hotel in Santon. Philippe is the EU Director for Advocacy at Human Rights Watch. Philippe, good afternoon to you. You've drafted this report about how countries are killing people when they're in other countries. What did you actually find?
Well, we find that there is, in fact, a growing pattern of repressive governments using their long arms to go after their critics who are living abroad in exile or seeking asylum in other countries. This is happening on a broad range of individuals, whether they are human rights defenders, journalists, political critics, or even, random people residing abroad and being critical of the government who face continued threats, harassment, sometimes online attacks, and sometimes physical attacks, and as you pointed out, in some cases also death. So we are seeing those different patterns of transnational repression as indeed increasingly worrying, and they deserve an international response, and deserve policies to protect the victims or the potential victims, but also measures to address and respond to the phenomenon.
I mean, it's quite something. If you leave a country because you're scared for your life and you go to another country, you're doing it because you should be safer there. And in fact, people are finding they aren't safer there.
Absolutely, you nailed it, right? This is exactly also the message that those repressive governments want to send. You will not be safe anywhere, whether you run away in a neighboring country or on another continent, whether you run away in a democratic country or in another less democratic country. And those cases are happening anywhere. On the 5 continents, you have states which are responsible for transnational repression, and on every continent, you have victims of transnational repression. It takes very different forms, right? Killings happen, of course, in very specific places. Unfortunately, what we are seeing in the EU, which I'm covering for my organization, are rather cases of, smear campaigns, harassment, people who spoke up, see their family back home being harassed, arrested, or intimidated by pro-government individuals. The problem with transnational repression is the difficulty to investigate those cases. There was a famous case in South Africa of the killing of a Rwandan critic back in 2014, in which even the Special Investigative Unit concluded about the likely involvement of Rwandan officials. Well, this is hard to prove in many cases, and it's even harder to prove that a smear campaign targeting you or your relatives in the country where you reside or where you come from is controlled and manipulated by your own repressive government. So the problem is identifying the problem, the cases, and responding accordingly.
You talk about responding accordingly. I don't know what that response would take. I mean, in some cases you can have proper investigations, and the Jamal Khashoggi case is a really good example of where, and in a way just through sheer luck, people were able to prove that Saudi Arabia was involved. But those cases are quite rare. In the Indian case in Canada, I don't think anyone can prove that. The Rwandan case, there was a lot of, sort of smoke around it. And the smear campaigns is even harder. So what kind of measures could actually work to protect people when they're in other countries?
Exactly. Look, transnational repression, when it happens, doesn't happen in individual and isolated acts. What happens is that one repressive government does use the same tactics, not just against one critic, but against several critics, not only in one country, but in several countries. And the case of Jamal Khashoggi is one, the tip of the iceberg of Saudi Arabia using its long arms to go after critics abroad. So what is important is that states where transnational repression happen do investigate those cases. As such, as part of a pattern of transnational repression, they should potentially information between the different investigations going on. In the European context, given the possibility to increase cooperation among EU member states, it's important to also look at this phenomenon as being cross-border, so that the victims can also raise and improve the way in which those investigations happen by recognizing that they are part of a system of human rights violations committed by their government of origin. And then in terms of the response, states have the capacity to do more. One way is, of course, to use for every state where transnational repression happens, to use their diplomatic tools as much as possible. Right? If a case of transnational repression happens in France, we would expect the French government to raise it with the country which is responsible through all diplomatic channels, including at the highest level. We would expect also all countries around the world where transnational repression happens to better document, what happens, who is responsible, who are the potential victims, and share, warnings to the people who might be targeted or who have been targeted, so that we don't just look at investigating the facts after they happen, when the people have been harassed or in the worst case killed, but also learn how to better prevent it. And finally, I really think that there is a need to look at how this phenomenon has affected human rights internationally. And here, I really think that the United Nations should dispatch an investigative mechanism to really look at where transnational happens, under which forms, and who is responsible, with a view to address and respond to the phenomenon globally.
The thing about it, Philippe, is that it's very effective. These countries wouldn't be doing it. It's very expensive, actually, to go and cause trouble for someone in a third country. Much easier to harass their family in your country, sure. But they wouldn't do it if it wasn't effective. It's very effective, isn't it?
It is very effective. It's also very effective because there are very little consequences, right? If you're a repressive government and go after your critics in another continent, there is very little chances that your behavior will be exposed at the international level, right? There have been cases of transnational repression in South Africa. Well, it raises questions about whether people are safe in South Africa, and you would expect as well that South Africa and the other countries where transnational repression happen do not accept that as a possibility. And the fact that a country exports its repression in another country where people should be safe, should be able to express their opinion, to enjoy their rights, is something which should not happen in any country in the world. So I think indeed increasing the political cost of this phenomenon, but also, again, increasing the awareness and the preparedness to respond to the phenomenon would make these practices more costly for the states which are responsible, and would facilitate the protection of the potential victims.
Philippe, thank you. The EU Director for Advocacy at Human Rights Watch. Really appreciate the time.